Hey guys, welcome. This is Caesar with Inspire Movement. We're continuing today with our series on servanthood, and we are joined none other than with Miss Dionne Coleman with Samaritan Village, Inc. It's going to be an awesome interview, and I look forward to all of the questions and insight that we're going to get. With that, I'm going to turn my attention to Miss D, who's going to give us a little bit of a brief intro. Anything that you are wanting to share with us. First, I'd like to, before we even get to going into the questions, just thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I realize that we've been trying to do this for the past few weeks, and I'm so glad that we're doing it now. A very important conversation that I certainly have been looking forward to, and I can't wait.
Awesome. Well, my name is Dee Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of Samaritan Village. Samaritan Village is a residential safe home here in the Central Florida area that provides a safe place for women that have been sexually trafficked and exploited to find healing and hope and to recover from their trauma, take back their lives so that they can become catalysts for change in their communities. So I've been the Executive Director for the last 4.5 years, where I have been here working right alongside survivors in their journey to healing. So it's been an incredible journey.
So can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, your personal journey to the position that you actively hold? Obviously, you've given us a little bit of the insight as to the organization and what it does, but just maybe expand a little bit on the actual program and what the ladies can look forward to when they're part of the program.
So my journey into working at Samaritan Village is one that I didn't expect. So when I was in college in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was sitting in my home church out in Southern California, and a pastor had come and she was sharing about this issue of human trafficking. The first time I'd ever heard the phrase, probably the first time that most people in that congregation had heard the phrase. And she was saying how over in other countries, Greece and Russia, there were women and children being stolen off the streets, kidnapped, held captive and hunkered down into these horrific situations where they were just being brutalized and abused. And I remember sitting there in church and getting chills up and down my arms and just praying out to God just silently, like, I think this is what I want to do. I feel called to that work. And asking God that he would just kind of orchestrate my steps so that one day I would be able to fly overseas and be able to do the work in helping these women and children. After that church service, I actually went back to school that next semester, changed my major to international relations, thinking that I was going to go do this work. But fast forward many years, my career took a different path, and I landed here in the Orlando area, and I was actually working in nonprofits giving away money. And so one of the organizations, Samaritan Village, landed in our desk, and I kind of looked them up, and I was like, wow, they're dealing with human trafficking victims here in Florida. I wonder what country they're from. And those were the thoughts that I had. And so, over time I thought, well, one day I'll be able to volunteer for them. And so one thing kind of led to another, and they needed an executive director, and my name was put in the list. And so when I got this job, I remember thinking, one, I don't feel equipped to do this work. But then two, the next immediate thought was just this vision of how God can resurrect things in our lives that we bury so deeply that we can forget about. And similarly to these women who have just been marred by abuse, often at really early ages, the work that I get to do with them and is to watch them blossom and remember or even discover for the first time the beauty of who they were created to be.
Powerful, very powerful indeed. I can tell you that, like we mentioned even in pre-interview, when Miss Ann Taylor connected us or brought up the idea to seek you out, I was in shock. And in doing some of the initial prep for this interview, where we stand as a state relative to the country, where we stand as a city relative to the state, and how pervasive the problem is shocking. I mean, I was kind of in shock when she said that this was an issue with Orlando, having been here for so long. It never even occurred to me that there was an organization that was tailoring services for victims of sex trafficking. As I say that, You've already now been the executive director for the Samaritan Village for at least 4 years, as I understand it. I don't know that I could do something like what you're doing because of the compassionate care and strength that you have to provide to the victims of sex trafficking. I think it takes a special person to even navigate the waters, very complicated waters of dealing with broken lives and folks that have dealt with so much pain and suffering. What do you think has prepared you in life to do what you're actively doing now and really have to, by the function of the job, give so much of yourself to these victims?
That's a good question. I think naturally I'm a helper. When I see a need or an issue that's affecting the world, I naturally want to go and make it right. So there's a little bit of that when people often say that they're helpers, you tend to think of somebody that's kind of, more softer and docile. I tend to be the opposite. Like, I'm very much a fighter. I will get dirty. I'm gritty. And so when it comes to this type of work, you need that, right? These women there's unimaginable things that they've experienced. But it's not just me. It's saying that, our name, Samaritan Village, we really are a village of people that are bringing their strengths to the table and saying, here's how we can walk this single woman through her process of healing, through her process to be restored to wholeness. So I often will get asked, oh my gosh, these women's stories, they're heartbreaking. Do you go home and cry every night? And I'm like, no. Because at the same time that I'm very much like a fighter and I'm gritty and, if there's a job to get done, I'm going to get it done. At the same time, I'm very much an optimist. And so I see the beauty. There's so much beauty that comes out of these women's lives and their stories. So most days, I'm going home and thinking like, oh my gosh, what an incredible day, this one particular woman had, or we've seen her grow so immensely. And oh my gosh, she's been restored with her children. Like, there's so many triumphant moments that come out of this. And for me, while the pain and the grief and the darkness that trafficking is built upon truly, when I'm on the side where I get to see the restoration. And so that's so encouraging. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Sure did, absolutely. It's something that it leaves you without words to even fathom what these folks are going through, or have gone through, and will continue to as they seek full reparation in their lives. Mm-hmm. So what prepared you, who prepared you, I guess is the question, in this way, whether it be your immediate family with your parents, maybe a pastor at a church or some community leader. I think we've all had and have mentors in our lives that channel our energies and our passions to where they need to be so that we could be, I guess, the light for the world. Who are those people for you?
Yeah, so, I feel like behind me is a village of people that have helped to equip me in being able to get to this point, to be able to do this job and to be able to carry it out successfully. I think first and foremost, that pastor that came to my home church when I was just a teenager, Christine Kane, and she was talking about this issue. I mean, she planted the seeds. Her vocalization of this issue is what planted seeds in my heart. And to this day, she continues to run a really successful anti-trafficking organization that is global. So I look to people like her. Survivors are absolutely my mentors. I think of some of the ones that are nationally known. There's Kathy Bryant, Rebecca Bender. There's so many survivors that have chosen to speak out and then to begin to inform all of us that are doing the work of what's really needed. And I think that is where this industry is headed in terms of helping people, is that survivors need to have their voices at the forefront. And then beyond that, specifically when it comes to this work, are the two directors before me. The first one being the founder and the second one being who started off as our clinical director, who really built this program from nothing. I mean, our founder, it was a vision and a dream that she had that started Samaritan Village based on her role as a chaplain in the Orange County Jail and based on her moving into a really rough part of Orlando and seeing this cycling in and out. And so I think that the pavers that they've laid, the bricks that they've laid, have really set the stage and planted seeds for what is happening now in this organization and the growth that we have. But more importantly, they still, to this day, continue, both of them, pour out into my journey as a leader of this organization. And so I feel very honored to be able to carry the torch even further for them.
Fantastic, and I'm sure you will.
Thanks.
Yeah, I do believe I found, again, in my prep for the interview, the founder of the organization. And, there was one testimonial from, I think, was maybe one of the first ladies that she helped, which I thought was incredibly powerful. I think maybe that's one of our coming questions is maybe I'll let you maybe season that a little bit, maybe some powerful testimonials that you're able to share in anonymity, obviously, of people that have greatly benefited from what you guys do. So why is the issue of sex trafficking so pervasive? When I think of it, when I try to even come to terms with what's happening, it's a systemic failure. It's not just the fact that you have traffickers, but you have customers as well that want to exploit these young ladies. So it's a wholesale problem. How do you, at least, in looking at it outwardly and not being completely naive as to, the underlying issues with this, what are some of the things that you believe are leading to the state of Florida being number 3 in the country, for this to be a global, not to in the backdrop of an actual pandemic, but to sort of use that word, another global pandemic of its sort. Why is this so pervasive?
So there's a number of reasons why it's pervasive. I think if we just start with probably the oldest reason, which is that for a long time, when we're talking about exploitation and sex trafficking specifically, that's the population that we work with, the definition of it is somebody who would engage in commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. When we look at what that looks like here locally, most, if not all, of the women that are sex trafficked through a pimp of some sort. So we can go back in time and say there's all sorts of glorification culturally of pimps and what that looks like, and don't prostitutes choose to sell their bodies, right? So if we don't understand what the issue even looks like, we can't address it. So it's just growing, right? That's one of the reasons. Florida specifically, we have a high tourism population outside of a pandemic. $50 billion industry, right? Like in terms of tourism in our country. Florida is the top tourist industry in the country. And so people can bring people in or move people around, and there's so much movement in and out of our state that I tell people they don't actually even have to bring a ton of women in. Traffickers can take local women. The buyers are coming to us. They're coming to our state. And so because of that, it leaves us in a very vulnerable position to not be able to kind of get a grips on where this is happening and who this is happening to. So when we look at it from that perspective, that's why it's so pervasive. One, we don't know what it looks. We haven't known what it looked like, and if we did, we were choosing to see these people as kind of perpetrators of self and not as victims. And then secondly, just the nature of the type of state that we have, a very heavy tourism state. But I always say, if you can wave a magic wand in the air and stop human trafficking, how could you do that, right? And the first is understanding that for traffickers, it is a business, and there is low risk and there's a high reward. We have women that have come into our program that had traffickers that were trafficking women in Orlando for 30 plus years, hundreds of women. And when they were finally arrested, they served 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. They're back now on the streets, all of these guys, doing the same thing. They know that there's very low risk in doing this. The other thing is we have to understand that we've got to stop looking at it as just like let's just bust down the doors, take all the traffickers and throw them away. This is a business, and we have to think about it as a business. And our community needs to surround it in such a way. It is, the average trafficker makes about $100,000 per year per woman that he traffics. There's a lot of money to be made in trafficking human bodies, and traffickers know this. And so high risk, low reward. The second thing is you alluded to, the systemic issues, right? If we're not addressing the housing crisis, if we're not addressing the opioid epidemic, if we're not addressing the lack of mental health care services in our communities, then we're going to see this churn. Because what happens to maybe a young single mom who doesn't have the education to get a job that's going to pay her what she needs to make a livable wage for her and her kid, and she falls into some sort of situation that makes her very vulnerable? It's going to be easy for someone to come in and say, well, hey, I'll offer you a place to stay, or I'll offer you some groceries, but it comes with an exchange, right? And before she realizes it, she's just trying to put a roof over her child's head and feed her child. And before she realizes it, she's entangled in an agreement that she did not even choose to make, or realize that she was making. How about that? She didn't even realize that she was choosing to make that type of a decision. And so we're watching that happen when we don't address systemic issues, when we look at the fact that we often talk about how young women and children are groomed into this lifestyle. Unfortunately, they're groomed by their traffickers. We also have to realize that traffickers are grooming young men from underserved communities to be that. When you have no other male figures in your life except for the man on the corner, right, who's got a whole bunch of money, and he's driving a fancy car, and he seems to have women around him all the time, and he goes, hey, I can teach you how to make a couple bucks. We have to realize that too, that our lack of interest in our youth also affects this issue. And then lastly, there's a whole lot of societal blinders that we have on, right? If we are promoting a culture in which the over-sexualization of children, and in our media, we're exposing them to, then there's a desensitization on how we, how we treat one another. So, high risk, low reward. We're not our systemic issues that are affecting us, and then we're also not looking at how we are perpetuating this issue in our own lives. So.
And to, I guess, piggyback on your second point, in terms of how these victims, these ladies, are potentially wanting to be in this business in and of themselves. It's important to note, at least again in prepping for the interview, that the average age of entry is from 11 to 14 years old. So at the time when when a young girl should be playing with Barbies and doing very innocent girl-like things, she's being sucked into an environment that I would presume at that age is somewhat normalized, but we know what it is. It's evil
Absolutely.
and seedy by its very nature, and they don't really have a choice about it because they're so young.
Absolutely. We serve a much older demographic, right? When you think about human trafficking, the faces that you see typically are younger, teenage girls, maybe girls in their 20s at the most, right, and kids. But what we have found in all of the women that have come through our house, that at some point in their early childhood, I'm talking under the age of 10 years old, they have dealt with physical and or sexual abuse. So when we're looking at 90% of victims are dealing with, have experienced some sort of physical or sexual abuse as an early child, and those gaping wounds are still there by the time they get 16, 17, and they're discovering who they are, and somebody sees that as an opportunity to exploit them. And all of a sudden at 17, 18, 19, we're like, we write them off as a society, right? She's choosing to be that way. Well, she's fallen through the cracks, and by the time Samaritan Village gets her, she's 40 years old, 35 years old, 30 years old, with a history of abuse spanning all the way back to when she was 2, 3, 4 years old. And we discount that, and we go, she chose that life, and we've negated everything in her experience that really made her a victim.
So why is this so under-addressed? Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the capacity for your program is, I believe, 9 women, right? For a period of 12 to 18 months. Yes. So from a year to year and a half, which is awesome at face value because you're changing 9 lives. You're almost allowing 9 people to get their lives back from that point forward. But as I understand it, just last year alone, you received over 400 referrals for the program. Why is this being so under-addressed? Is it just lack of information? Is it just lack of political will? I don't really know what the underlying reasons are, but clearly the problem is way bigger than the solutions that are to be offered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is just, it's lack of awareness, it's lack of education, it's not understanding that this is an issue that we all kind of play into. And so, and really not understanding that it affects every facet of our communities, right? When we look at crime, when we look at addiction, all those issues, this touches on that. But because we don't see it that way, then we go, oh, well, I'd rather just throw money here, or I'm going to give resources to this, but not that. And also, sex trafficking is just, it's a topic that it doesn't go over well at dinner parties, you know? So it's not a topic that people really want to talk about, especially when for the last, 500 years, we've assumed that prostitutes want to be living that lifestyle.
It's kind of a callous way to look at that problem, pervasive problem. So what is the long path to recovery look like for a victim of sex trafficking? When I try to think of it on my own, but I'm gonna obviously, hopefully you can fill some of the gaps for us. I thought, well, maybe some of these women, which you can say maybe they were lucky to be incarcerated. At the point of incarceration is when Samaritan Village, through a series of referrals, winds up receiving a potential program participant. Right. Is that the way? But I just don't know enough about it. Maybe you can sort of clue us in. What does that look like before, they actually start the program? How did it all piece together? It
can look a number of ways. I think you touched on probably the main way that Samaritan Village receives their referrals through law enforcement. We work very closely. We are fortunate here in Orange County that our law enforcement has a dedicated task force for trafficking. And so alongside of that, they've got victim advocates that are right there on the scene when they do a major bust. But then there are a lot of women, most, that aren't picked up in these major, criminal busts. They're discovered by landing in jail over other crimes. So I see traffickers, they're businessmen, right? This is just a body I'm using to generate income. So if I can't sell her at night because it's 10 a.m. in the day, I might have her go sell drugs or steal, and so women engage in a lot of petty crimes and criminal activities based on being forced to by the traffickers. So they'll land in jail for a number of different reasons. And then, of course, addiction is one of those key hooks that traffickers use to keep women bound. And that will land them in jail. And so really, we rely heavily on ministries in jail, on the social workers in there, to start looking at the repeat offenders. Why does she keep why does she keep landing in jail? And that's where we found that a lot of women that would not otherwise be identified are being identified. So they'll give us a call, and I'll go into the jail and meet with a young woman, and they're like, we suspect that she might be working for someone. And so what we have to do is then build relationship with her, because nobody's going to go, oh yeah, I'm being trafficked. Half the time they don't even know what that is or recognize that they're a victim. And so it's building a relationship with her, and then understanding, and then being able to see that, she's being exploited by somebody, and then we kind of get a history there. But a great deal of victims are recovered through, law enforcement or other agencies throughout the country. We get referrals from probably all 50 states.
Unbelievable. How tricky is that in terms of now they're in jail, they're incarcerated, to develop, I guess, the necessary bond to create an awareness within the victim themselves that, boy, I am being trafficked. I'm part of a system that is much bigger than me. How tricky is that? Maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so it is tricky. And we've even had women that we knew, we were working with their victim advocates, that they were being trafficked, and they still could not wrap their mind around it, right? And so entering into our program, still not feeling like, well, I'm not a victim. These were just bad choices that I made. And it's like, no, you act legally. You're in a court case because you are a victim. So there's that. But building relationship and understanding, building that rapport is difficult. When you think about women that are being trafficked by family members, by boyfriends, husbands, their children's fathers, people that they have a really strong bond to, and that is what traffickers will do. They want to bond with them. That trauma bonding is important in keeping them in the cycle and in the loop. And so having to explain to someone that they care deeply for, even if he is sadistically abusive, that he is exploiting you, that you are a victim of abuse by him, it's hard. And it can be very shaming to realize that you're a victim. And even when we look out culturally, that's one of the things that Samaritan Village is really tackling right now, is understanding the different cultural norms in terms of what this looks like, right? When we go into the Hispanic community, what does trafficking look like and what does it feel like to the survivors, and being able to communicate in such a way that they get that. When we go into the African American community and the Black community, what does their experience as trafficking victims feel like? And again, with our Caucasian sisters, like, what is that experience like for them? And we've seen that there are different cultural phrases and terms, and how they digest or how they have processed the trauma that they've received and translating over through it, like their cultural lens. So Samaritan Village this year has been very committed on making sure that we have representation, and that women are, when we do go into jail, that they see somebody and they're talking to somebody who knows what they've experienced. And so it's really important to us.
Have any of the program, I don't know if graduates is the word, but women that have been through the program and restored their lives in some manner, have they been part of Samaritan Village after the fact?
Yes.
I'm just wondering.
Yes, we actually have a number of our graduates that are now mentors to women that are currently in our program, that are addiction sponsors, that are sponsoring women. We are building and have built a community that is just incredible. In 2019, we kicked off our 10-year anniversary, and out of that year, we launched an expansion campaign so that we could have more houses and more services for the number of women and referrals that we were receiving. But it was important to me and to our leadership team that we not just make assumptions about what we felt our community needed or what we felt the community of survivors needed here in Orlando. So we actually rounded up every single woman that had ever touched our house, had ever been in our house, whether they graduated our program or didn't, and asked them, when you left Samaritan Village, what is it that you needed? And there were two things that came out of that conversation. It was housing, and it was, we felt like when we left, we lost our village. We surround them with so many amazing people and opportunities while they're in our program, that when they would be a year out, you just kind of get into your own rhythm of life and you get removed. And, recidivism, relapse, exploitation, those are incredibly, it's still incredibly high, and they're still at a very high risk factor of those things happening within the first 3 years of completing a program. And so we have in that took that information, and we've started our Survivor SOAR group, which is basically for any female survivor in the Central Florida area that wants to get together twice a month. And one of the meetings, we have bring in an expert facilitator to talk about everything from finance to how do you have healthy sexual relationships, right? That's something people don't want to talk about. And then the second one is just a fellowship group, having the women just create friendships and feel like they're in community. And because of that, Samaritan Village is able to continue wrapping around services for them. So if they're having a low month, we can say, hey, we've got your therapy needs covered. You're good. Or if you need supplies, or your kid is going back to school and you need school supplies for them, we've got that. So that's been one of the things. And then the other aspect, housing, has been our big initiative to expand to more housing.
So can you tell us a little bit on what happens as far as any sort of social service provision for the graduates of the program, particularly knowing that these women are probably going to require some form of long-term care? Invariably, you can't go through what they went through in early childhood and have this traumatic experience for a wide expanse of your life and be squeaky clean with just, whether it be 12 months or a year and a half treatment.
Right.
What services are available, if any, for them long term?
So for graduates, there have been historically very few services that they're able to afford, because once they complete a program, they now are on their own for obtaining those services. And that's why Samaritan Village said, hey, if we can start this SOAR group, allow any survivor that's completed a program, that's graduated from a program, come and get the support, then we can wrap around with all those services that they would need. And so those services are what we offer in our main house. And so in our main house, there's kind of what I call 5 buckets, right? The bottom floor of what we do is providing a spiritual foundation, spiritual development. And then from there, building on top of that, is really our clinical backbone, the therapeutic backbone. So every woman in our program receives individualized and individual therapy with a licensed mental health counselor. And then our clinical director every quarter looks at our program, looks at the women, looks at their specific needs as individuals and says, hey, on top of your individual therapy, we're gonna add in anger management or equine therapy or CBT and all the art therapy. We do all the therapies. And then our women will then, as they're moving through the program, we're looking at what are their vocational options. So getting them through job training. So we partner with an organization called Jobs Partnership and Career Source, and then their education. Valencia College is a huge partner of ours in that they provide survivors with scholarships to obtain higher education. And for those that aren't even ready for that may need to get their GED, we're bringing in tutors to help fill that educational gap. So all of those things, and one of the first things that we do, even beyond all of that, when they first land to us, is their medical needs. As you can imagine, these women have gone a significant amount of time neglecting their bodies because they're unable to get to a doctor or see a dentist or go get their eyes checked. So in order to address the emotional and the mental needs that they have, they first have to feel good physically, and so addressing those medical needs. So those 5 buckets. So taking all of those things and saying all of those resources that we have in our main program are available to women that are in our graduate program as they need it. So it's less structured of a program because they're obviously, by this point, they're working full time, they're in school, they're living their lives. But to say, hey, you need a root canal, Samaritan Village can come alongside you and help you with that.
So given that you guys are now 10 years running, right, or 10 years plus, what is, I guess, your, I don't know if, success, statistics, if you will. What's the percentage of folks that stay down a path that you figure, okay, this is a path to normalcy?
Yeah.
Have you been able to assess that within the period of time that you've been there?
So we have, and when we assessed it when I first joined around the 4 years ago, and we actually had a really high success rate. It was about, for this industry, which was about 43% was our success rate. So I have shied away from using the numbers at this point because when you look at the trauma that these women experience, it's lifelong. And then about 2 years ago, there was a research article that came out that basically said from the time a woman is rescued, there lies 3 years of vulnerability where she's vulnerable to relapse, re-exploitation, and recidivism. And once she's out of that 3-year window, then the success rate of her living a long and healthy lifestyle goes up like 63%. So we have been focusing less on let me get a woman from jail to the end of our 18-month program and saying we're going to walk with her long term. And that has been our expansion plan, to say if we can fill our main house, if a woman comes to us right directly from jail, essentially off the streets, does 18 months in our main house, and then we have a transition home where she's doing another 12 to 18 months, and now we have a third house that we received over the pandemic that allows them to basically have an affordable housing option, that they get these wraparound services, but they're off living independently. We have just filled that gap of vulnerability. So we're just now embarking on this expansion plan, and we're really excited to say that now we're not going to see what we were seeing before, which we could get a woman to graduation, but you count 12 months after that, and she was struggling. Now we're hopeful that we'll see that women are going to be much stronger and much more resilient for a longer period of time.
That's awesome. Fantastic. So I came up on an acronym, which I'd like for you to expound on. I believe it's an initiative program. I'm not exactly sure, but SAFE. Strategic Alliance to Fight Exploitation in Central Florida.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, so SAFE is a new alliance here in Central Florida, and it's based off of a model of an organization in Washington State. So 3 leaders came together here in Central Florida and said, hey, we've been hearing how terrible trafficking is affecting our community. We could take that model of an organization in Washington and bring it here to Orlando. And so that is how Greg Snyder and Daryl and Karen Lane started SAFE in Central Florida. And they've asked me to be on the advisory council. And essentially, they are bringing together all of the stakeholders here in Central Florida, whether that's law enforcement, churches, nonprofit organizations like Samaritan Village, service providers, and saying, hey, how do we come together to make the biggest impact on eradicating this issue here? So they brought us all to the table, and we've sat down and we've all had conversations and have brainstormed and said, all right, now let's figure out what is the biggest gap right now in stopping this. Is it housing? Is it lack of housing? Is it lack of mental health services? Is it education and awareness, prevention and awareness? You know, I think that's huge. If you can educate young children while they're young, if you can educate parents and leaders, then you kind of stop the drip, right? So that's where SAFE is at right now, is identifying what in Central Florida, what in Orlando is the biggest need on this issue. And so then once that's determined, they go out, raise the funding to fund that initiative, and then they come back together, they fill that gap, and then they move to the next one. So if it starts off at prevention and awareness, then they will gather up people to fund prevention and awareness programs. And then when that seems to be moving well, they'll move to the next one, which could be housing or, services. So
yeah, I think education definitely plays a role societally because, again, going back to what we talked about, circling back to what we talked about earlier on, it's not just the victim, but it's also the trafficker and ultimately the end consumer that makes this a business.
Right. Absolutely.
So if you knocked out, the end consumer, then there wouldn't be a business.
Absolutely.
Which is a much more taller tale, I suppose, to try to attack. But certainly awareness and education is the key. So you've embarked on an initiative this year, which I'd like for you to share a little bit on. I believe you named it the Year of Prayer. Tell us a little bit about the Year of Prayer. Why is this so important to you and your mission?
We decided to make 2021 a year of prayer after coming off of such a hard year in 2020 and all of the issues that were affecting our nation and our world. We just felt called to kind of press into prayer. And so we found, it actually was a really unique story in that we found a book called How to basically heal our country from this issue of human trafficking through prayer. The author's name is Nick Canuso, and so he wrote this book, and each chapter of the book has different facets of the issue of human trafficking for prayer. And so we adopted that model, and every single week for 52 weeks, we have somebody that is praying for one of the facets. So we're praying for traffickers, we're praying for the victims, we're praying for survivors in their recovery journey, we're praying for the buyers, because this is an issue that only God can really help us to restore and to heal both our nation and this issue as a whole. So
powerful. And I do certainly believe in prayer as a believer. Prayers go a long way, and that's exactly what we all need to do collectively to attack something so pervasive and bad, evil, for lack of a better word. So we do still find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic, and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's still something that we're hopeful of with the advent of the vaccinations and whatnot. But in talking to everyone, everybody's been affected. Nonprofits have definitely been affected. Can you tell us some of the challenges that you've had to face over the last year? And then as a second part question to that, what can we all do to help?
So, I think for us, the challenge has been the silence. And which is, most people are surprised when I say that, because they'll say like, oh, we're getting lots of referrals, but there was a period of time where it was silent. And you'd almost think, oh, that's probably a good thing. And I actually interviewed Sheriff Mina, and I asked him, had he seen if the numbers of calls or cases that they were seeing on human trafficking cases had risen, and he said he hadn't. But he knew that traffickers were adaptable and that they were adapting to this new climate. And so that being said, the challenge that we are facing is what is to come. And we're preparing for a great deal of people that are going to come out of this pandemic that have been unaccounted for, in the sense of, when the pandemic first started, I was talking to a dear friend who runs a school for young women that are just kind of in underserved communities or at risk. They don't do well in typical public school. And so when the pandemic happened and all the schools shut down, she deployed all of her staff to do home visit checks. Just lay an eye on each kid and let them know that you're there for support. So she did that, and when she came back, all the teachers came back, they basically said there were about 4 girls, and it's a smaller school, maybe 150 kids. There were about 4 girls they just could not get in contact with. So they kept going out. So eventually, they started asking the peers, well, have you seen so-and-so? Have you even heard anything from her? The parents didn't even know where these young women were. That's kind of the lifestyle that these young women were coming from. Long story short, some of their peers said, well, we know that so-and-so is staying at such and such motel with her much older boyfriend, or she decided that she didn't want to be home with her mom, so now she's at her much older 40-year-old boyfriend's house with his kids. Well, these are 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. Without some of the structure in place of community, there are a lot of people falling through the cracks. When people were losing their jobs because of layoffs, and you go into work every day and all of a sudden you don't have a job to go into, and you may not have a lot of family, or you may not have friends that are going to check on you. You kind of fall into this kind of dark oblivion. Those are the people that become vulnerable, and we're seeing that traffickers, and this is confirmed by Sheriff Mina, that's what they are expecting and seeing, is that traffickers are using kind of the quietness of this pandemic to exploit people. And I think when things begin to resume to normal, we're going to notice and discover that there's been a lot of abuse and a lot of exploitation that has happened under the radar. And so for us, it is setting ourselves up as an organization in such a way that we will be able to carry some of that fallout, that we'll be able to receive those calls and not have to turn those women away. Our challenge pre-pandemic and now is, you said it earlier, we received over 400 calls, is that there's just not enough resources and capacity to serve the need that we have.
So as we come full circle on our interview, and I feel like we could do this again, part 2, 3, and 4, because there's so much to be shared. And it is, like you mentioned, it's not maybe table talk for probably most families, I would want to say, but I believe in certain respects it should be, because it's really the only way that we can create awareness within our own families of what's actually going on. And the more we bring it to light, the more it gets out of the dark. So I'd like to, I guess, touch on 2 things. We talked about, I don't know if you've had a chance to think of a powerful testimonial that you'd like to share with us, and connect with our audience when you do so, please. And lastly, any aspirational goals that you have for yourself and the organization.
Beautiful. So a couple of years ago, I was in the Orange County Jail, and I was actually there to interview a young woman for a program. As I was getting ready to leave, the jail chaplain came and chased me down and asked me if I would meet with one woman that she thought really deserved to go to a program and had been praying for a program. And so I met with this woman, and she was very excited and to join any kind of program. She had been estranged from her entire family. She had been sitting in jail for about 6 months on drug charges, but as we got to know each other, had lived really just a life of a lot of exploitation that started when she was married really young, and was abused and exploited by her husband. So fast forward to this woman who's in her 40s, and she joins our program, and she's doing really well for the first couple of months. And about month 3, I get a phone call on my cell phone asking if we knew where this woman was, because they had some family news and they did not know where she was. So that's how estranged she was from her family, was that they didn't know if she was even in the state of Florida, but they were just trying to track her down. Her daughter had overdosed and landed in a coma in the hospital. and they didn't think that she was going to make it. And so I actually had to go and relay this news to her, and it was devastating. I mean, I'm a mother, and I can't imagine the devastation of understanding or seeing your child in such a horrific state. So for 30 days, our village basically sat vigil with her in that hospital bedside, day and night. We would get volunteers, myself, my team, we would get up and we'd go sit by the bed at this hospital as she sat there with her daughter in this coma. And I always said that if there was ever a moment that you could go back to bad habits, if there was ever a moment to relapse, if there was ever a moment to give up on restarting your life, that was it. Watching your child literally die. This woman turned this whole experience in the death of her daughter, in that situation with her daughter, actually became the fuel for her to complete our program. And she is now, and out of that, she was able to reconcile with all of her other children and her extended family who she had been completely estranged from. And so now she is working, she's raising her daughters that are still in school. She mentors some of the women that are currently in our program, and she is a bright ray of light. And I just don't know how many people could have gone through that type of situation in the middle of an incredibly difficult recovery program and came out on the other side as joyous and as light as she is. So it's one of my favorite stories to tell because I feel like we were all right there with her, just walking her through that situation. And quite frankly, there were days where I just thought she might get up and walk out of these doors, and she didn't. She persevered.
Incredibly powerful.
There was another question you asked me, but I didn't.
No, that's okay. We're all sort of like immersed in this testimony. Our wrap-up question is aspirational goals that you may have for yourself and for the organization.
I think where Samaritan Village is headed is to be a refuge and a place of safety for women here in our community that don't have other options. But beyond that, we're here to help build up these women that come to us. When they come to us, they come so broken, with so little. And it's such a beautiful honor and privilege to be able to watch them blossom and bloom into the people that I think God has created them to be. But then taking that even further and saying that you weren't just here to exist, but you were here for a purpose. And so getting to watch them develop in their leadership and give back to women that are walking through the shoes that they were just in is incredible. And I think that that's what we're building, is an army of women that are going to be able to do exactly what our name says. Our name, Samaritan Village, came from the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 who had this encounter with Jesus, and she goes back and she transforms her community, right? She goes back and tells her whole community about Jesus. And that's essentially what we want these women to be. And that's what's being built. I mean, these women that have graduated our program are literally transforming their own communities.
Well, Ms. D, thank you incredibly much for taking time out of your day, taking time out of your life to share this very powerful message with us. I certainly enjoyed our conversation, and I can't wait to do it again sometime in the future where you can tell us more about what you're up to and what Samaritan Village is up to as well. In that testimony that I alluded to previously that I found on YouTube, I believe the lady talked about the founder of Samaritan Village as one of these generals or sergeants or army leaders, as he alluded to the word army now, heavenly sent. And while it's so easy on this earth to sort of lose faith and to just lose hope, it's so easy to lose hope. Certainly when you're broken and in major pain, it's very easy to. I commend you. You are certainly either a general or sergeant. I'm not sure what the military positions are. But continue doing your God's work and changing lives for the better. Thank you so much.
Thank you.